Hello everyone. Welcome to the webinar, The New Big Science, Linking Data to Understand People and Context, with Christopher Browning, Barbara Entwistle, Beth Bussell, and Emilio Moran, 4 editors and contributors to the current issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. My name is Michael Todd, and I'm the Community Manager of the Methods-Based website. Let me begin by introducing you to our moderator, Emilio Moran. Before we start the conversation, Emilio F. Moran was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2010 and to the National Science Board in 2016. He is the John A. Hanna Distinguished Professor associated with the Center for Global Change and Earth Observations, the Center for System Integration and Sustainability, and the Department of Geography, Environment, and Spatial Sciences at Michigan State University. Working at the nexus of data and people, his research focuses on land use and land cover change, demography, dynamics of deforestation and reforestation, and the interface between the social and natural sciences. This 1-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it and to access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. And if you have any questions with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions to speakers throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag, #SageTalks, and feel free to ask questions or leave comments there. Now, let's start the conversation. Emilio, to you.
Welcome to everybody participating at this event. And I would like to begin by putting out the challenge that the Annals volume raised for readers. One of the things that this volume addresses is the problem of a growing difficulty in the social and behavioral sciences in coping with the amazing growth of new data, social media data, big data from sources that are untraditional to the social sciences, the fact that our bread and butter data from the national surveys has a declining response rates, which makes it challenged as to the what it tells us in terms of representation of the American people. We have had rapid social and environmental changes that are a challenge to measurement. And the economy and social groups are changing in rapid ways, creating virtual communities, which are in contrast to real communities in space. Next slide, please. The next slide. So the special issue of the Annals is an effort that has taken 6 years in the making. We convened 6 years ago an effort to understand how we might cope in the social and behavioral sciences with this change in the environment, particularly data environment for social and behavioral science. How can we best handle this disparate data? How can we get a handle of it, and how it might be organized in order to address this national challenge? One of the important sources of data besides the social media that I've already mentioned is administrative data sitting in local, state, and federal governments, which have not been, for the great majority of SB sciences, a focus of attention. How does that kind of data collected for administrative reasons fit in with the more sampling approach used in survey research? Next slide. So one of the things that we try to address is how can we cope with big data, and yet rather than lose attention to local experiences of the American population, how can we make big data speak with greater granularity about the experience of local people and local places. A lot of this data, social media data, administrative data, is individual data with a great deal of detail that can expand what and how we actually address social phenomena. We can better understand neighborhoods with this kind of rich data that we can by simply a sampling approach. So one of the things we focus our attention for the last 6 years is how can we develop more refined tools to better design policy instruments that address this great human variability that exists across the nation and across the world. Next slide, please. So this effort comes out of a realization that we have to develop better cyber infrastructure for the social and behavioral sciences. It is an area that social and behavioral science has not invested as much as other fields, and that allows us to address neighborhood and census tracts at a great deal of detail. In order to do that, we need to also develop new ways to collaborate across the disciplines, not just in the social and behavioral sciences, but with the natural sciences, since so much of the human experience is increasingly affected by the environment within which we exist. Our current national surveys, which are many, there are more than 17, are expensive, and the declining response rates are a challenge of how can we find new ways to complement that data and address a richer experience of the American people. So we began to think about developing some kind of regional set of observatories or data centers that would be embedded across the nation, that would be national representative of the population, but also representative of all places, not just large population centers, but also the ones where population is more sparse and which may have very different experience than those where density is higher. A phenomena that we know affects phenomena like our most recent election, for example. So what kinds of data do we think should be collected? Administrative data of many kinds, great detail, whether it be voting records, motor vehicle records, phone directories, credit card data. There's enormous challenges to confidentiality in this data, but I think those things can be addressed as the census has done by particular approaches. Next. So by developing a national network of regional data centers, we will gain a national framework for studying local contexts for social dynamics. We would get a national SBE cyber infrastructure to serve 21st century society. Next, please. A national framework for studying the impact of social media. Right now, social media is largely used in sophisticated ways by companies that handle social media, but often the way they use that data is simply to promote the interests of the company, but not to inform social science theory and social science concerns. And we also think that social regional data centers could be the next crucible for developing interdisciplinary collaboration across the SBE sciences. Next slide. So in short, and to end my presentation, I think this volume helps us to address the challenge of linking the diverse data that we should be using in the SBE sciences, but in a way that is cumulative, accurate, and accessible to researchers across all fields, to develop new methods, and I think that's the focus of this volume, that can link persons and information across different platforms. And thirdly, a link what has not been linked to address fundamental questions about social and behavioral processes. I think this volume advances our knowledge because it links traditional areas of social and behavioral science with new data, whether it be Google Street View or whether it's other kinds of data from administrative data, as in the case of Katrina experience, in order to better understand human response, human decision making. Thank you. Our next speaker is going to be Elizabeth Fussell. Is a demographer and sociologist who studies population change in New Orleans since Hurricane Katrina, as well as environmental causes of migration throughout the United States. Elizabeth is an associate professor of population studies in the Population Studies and Training Center at Brown. Elizabeth.
Thanks, Emilio. And thank you to the organizers of this session and the volume. So I'm just going to give you a brief synopsis of my article, in which we were really trying to prove the concept that we could merge data about population and environmental hazards. We wanted to test the hypothesis that demographic change after a hurricane was maybe as much about the pre-disaster population trend as it was about the event itself. And so to do that, we needed to find data on both county-level population change and county-level hazard exposure. So our challenge was to find data that would have the spatial and temporal variability and depth, and to really look at these relationships over a long period of time and make sure that we were reaching generalizable conclusions. So the first slide I'm showing you here comes from our article, and what I want to point out here is that variability in hazard-related losses is not, it is great across space, but also across time. In the orange colored map, you see the variability in the combined losses due to all hazards across all U.S. counties in just a single year. So 2008 was a year that didn't have actually a whole lot of hazards in it, so it's a good representation of what a typical year looks like. What you notice, though, is that the pattern in that year is really different from the pattern when you look at the 10-year cumulative hazard losses in the map on the right-hand side. So that was our first challenge, was to figure out whether we can measure well variability over time and space in hazard-related losses. Yeah, next slide, please. So in the next slide, what you see is that we really wanted to focus on hurricanes, and our question has to do with whether the hurricane-related population changes that we observed after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, whether that sort of massive migration is exceptional or if it's a generalizable pattern. So if you could take me back to 2 slides, that would be the right slide for my comments. So what you notice here is that, of course, combined hazard losses, which people who use the SHELDIS data that we're using in our study, and so I should give a shout out to the University of South Carolina for doing a great job in putting together this data. Often people look at combined hazard losses, as you see in the figure on the left, but we're really just interested in the effects of hurricanes, which we think would send a stronger signal to produce population change. So hurricanes only affect a certain region of the country, the southern region of the country, and the Northeast. And so the hurricane coast that you see there is where we limit our data. We're basically just looking at hurricane-related losses in any county that's ever been affected by a hurricane during the period under study, which is from 1980 through 2012. Okay, next slide. The point of all of those 2 slides that I've just shown you is that we really, to answer this question, we needed to find data that had both the spatial scope and longitudinal depth as to represent the full variation in these measures. So this slide, it's critical to both our prediction and our outcome. We predict that future population growth after a hurricane would be related, it would be continuous with the past population growth. And what you can see here is that there's a lot of variability across counties in terms of growth and decline, where the center of the country is, a lot of counties are experiencing population decline or very modest growth, whereas much of the population growth is occurring in, on the coasts and in urban areas. So the main hypothesis we were looking at was sort of what I just said, that after a hurricane event, we expected that future population growth would be explained as much by the past population trends as by any actual hazard losses, whether they're cumulative or current year. So the next slide shows you, gives you a little tidbit of what we found and that what you'll see in the article if you read it. So when we use it, we predict the probability of future growth based on past growth and cumulative losses, current year losses, and what we find is that in these counties that have declining past population growth, whether they're low density or high density, the effect of cumulative losses from hurricanes is really modest. The fact that these little groups of bars where losses are held at their mean and at one standard deviation above their mean or no losses, there's very little variation in those two groups that you see. But on the right-hand side, what you see is for counties that are growing, whether they have low density with the low bars or in the last panel, when they have high density, what we really see is that it's only in those growing high-density counties that past cumulative losses from hurricanes strongly affect future population growth. And so we find support for our hypothesis that past population growth matters more, and in some places the hazard-related losses matter more than in other places. Putting together this data was the big challenge, and now that we've been able to assemble these models and prove that there is some signal from the environment to population, we feel encouraged to keep going with this data. So I'll wrap it there and pass it on to Chris Browning.
Let me introduce Chris Browning, who is a distinguished professor of sociology and an affiliate for population research at Ohio State University. His research focuses on neighborhood and activity space and its influence on health and development. He's a principal investigator of the adolescent health and development in context study. Chris.
Well, thanks to Emilio and Barbara, and also the co-editors of this volume, and for the ANNALS for putting together an excellent issue, and for the opportunity to share our research in the context of this webinar. So I'll give you a quick overview of the research question and findings, but I'll also emphasize the data collection project that underlies this analysis, because I think it has some relevance for understanding pathways forward for pursuing a kind of local repository of data along the lines of the Social Observatory's theme. So our research question had to do with understanding exposure to places with high violence rates among urban youth. We know that witnessing violence and victimization is potentially important as a determinant of health and well-being for youth, but above and beyond these experiences, just spending time in areas known to be violent can be a source of chronic stress for youth. So we were particularly interested in the magnitude and the explanation for the racial disparity in exposure to violent areas. And we wanted to consider not just the neighborhood of residents, as is typically done, but also the actual everyday exposures of urban adolescents, whether they were in the neighborhood or not. So our concern was that the assumption in the standard literature that residential neighborhoods, typically the census tract, are an adequate proxy for actual exposures among urban youth. And we wanted to see how much additional explanatory power we actually got from measuring activity spaces, the actual locations of everyday exposure among youth, beyond just residential neighborhood environment. So in order to estimate the level of exposure to violent areas, we designed a study to follow a sample of Franklin County, Ohio youth, and that's the county that encompasses Columbus. We focused on youth ages 11 to 17 over the course of 1 week with a focus on activity space exposures and then youth behavioral and health outcomes. Next slide, please. So the study combines a conventional social survey here in the entrance survey column in the slide you're seeing, where we asked about a number of different topics, including the location of routine activities, but also health and well-being, family structure, family experiences, and so on. We then asked the youth to carry a GPS-enabled smartphone in order to capture actual travel paths over the course of 1 week. Finally, at the end of that week, an exit survey involved a space-time diary interview in-home where we walked the youth through 5 days of the previous week to capture continuous information on locations and to help the process of cleaning the GPS data that we've gathered through the phone. So for the ANNALS analysis, we measured time-weighted level of violence to which the youth was exposed over the course of each day using the youth's GPS travel path, and then combined with violent crime data from the Columbus Division of Police aggregated to the census block group level. We could then examine the extent to which family level and then census-based residential neighborhood block group and activity space block group level measures of disadvantage across a number of dimensions were associated with exposure to violent areas, and then the extent to which they explain the racial disparity in this outcome as well. So briefly, our findings indicated that the residential neighborhood context of the youth accounted for only about 1/3 of the variance in exposure to violent areas. So by the conventional design, one would expect that neighborhood of residents would account for all of this exposure. That is, if embedding youth in their census tract or other census unit was appropriate, we'd expect those units to actually account for all the variability in exposure to violent areas. But that was not the case. Unsurprisingly, being black was associated with a 66% increase in the average violence level of areas to which youth are exposed outside of the home. And we also found that family factors accounted for only about 12% of that disparity. Neighborhood factors, residential neighborhood disadvantage, accounted for about half of the baseline racial disparity, which was a large amount, but not all of it, as we might expect based on a conventional design. Activity space measures of disadvantage explained over 80% of the baseline racial disparity, and the racial effects, the black-white difference, was no longer significant once we included the activity space predictors, suggesting the importance of collecting the information about actual everyday exposures beyond just the residential neighborhood environment. So the implications, I think, are that not only are neighborhoods perhaps not complete proxies for exposures, but also that we can actually gather data using mobile devices fairly effectively. It's the case that the mobile data were fairly complete in their coverage. Youth tended to carry the phones pretty consistently. And we also had a component in which we asked youth about their experiences in the moment using what's called ecological momentary assessment, mini surveys on the phone. This also allowed us to gather a range of other real-time data. Nevertheless, there are a variety of challenges associated with mobile data collection, and I'll probably be getting into those shortly here, but we think that mobile devices hold the potential to capture incredibly rich real-time data on social environment and experience, and may serve as possibly even a new approach to the administration of more conventional social survey questions as well. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That's a very exciting study. Our final speaker today is Barbara Anguish, who is the Kennan Distinguished Professor of Sociology, also has affiliations with departments of Geography, Ecology and Environment, and International Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her research focuses broadly on the study of social, natural, and built environments and the consequences for a range of demographic and health outcomes. Dr. Anguish was one of the first social scientists to blend social and spatial methods in survey research, and she was very active as a contributor in designing the ANNALS publication. Barbara?
Thank you, Emilio. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody on the webinar, depending on where you are. I thank Sage Publications for sponsoring this. I'm really interested to see how this goes. The social and behavioral sciences are at a remarkable juncture. Diverse data from transactional sources, the internet, social media, and other sources not designed for research can now be used in varying degrees, making it possible to ask and answer questions about social interaction and behavior in new ways, and especially to put that in its context. I appreciate the presentations by Beth Fussell and Chris Browning, and of course very much to appreciate Emilio's introduction to this whole webinar. I want to talk a little bit more about Beth and Chris's presentations because in many ways they exemplify the themes of the volume. In each case, there is an important question driving the research, be it the relationship between population change and losses from hurricanes, or if it's exposure to violence and ultimately what the consequences of that are. Each draws on diverse data to answer their questions. Beth draws on historical census data for counties and also on SHELDAS, the Spatial Hazards, Events, and Losses Database US, a proprietary product created at the University of South Carolina. Chris uses locational data collected through smartphones, geocoded crime statistics, American Community Survey data, EMAs, and other short surveys. As you can see, in both cases, linking is key to the innovation and the success of the analyses that were done. Together, these two studies illustrate differences found in all of the studies included in the ANNALS volume. In terms of spatial scale, you have counties for the U.S. and Beth's case versus block groups for the city of Columbus. In terms of temporal scale, it ranges from decadal to momentary. In terms of social scale, we see communities, neighborhoods, and individuals. So the way I think about it, the question I pose is this. What if we imagined a multidimensional space that could accommodate data of varying social, spatial, and temporal scales in an organized way? What if we imagined a data repository containing diverse data linked according to social, spatial, and temporal unit? What if we imagine the kind of detailed information on activities that Chris and his team have collected, but for the entire country? What if we imagine those data embedded in the social environmental coverages that Beth and her team are using in their work? Right now, each team of researchers is working in a fairly self-contained way. That's fine. That's normal. Standing back, though, in addition to each team's science, there's a potential to assemble a data resource that would create opportunities for insight and analysis far beyond the individual studies. Stitching such a resource together requires that we master linkages, specifically and more generally. I call it quilting a time-place mosaic. Linkages, of course, are the focus of the volume. I like the metaphor of the quilt for several reasons. One is that it is a clear instance of the whole being more than the sum of the parts. Each patch has its own pattern and characteristics. Stitched together, each patch contributes to a larger pattern. The time-place mosaic I'm thinking of is like that. Each study constitutes a patch in the larger mosaic. Another reason why I like the metaphor of the quilt is that the linkages that unite the different patches and different layers. If we integrate the data resources produced by individual studies with clear concepts and well-designed linkages, the data infrastructure that we would create would be tightly interlinked, like a well-made quilt. Each study in the volume is solving an aspect of this. Taken together, the volume moves the field forward. Of course, many challenges remain. How to protect privacy, how to guarantee confidentiality, how to incorporate proprietary data. These are just a few. There is great potential, but there's also risk. But I am by nature optimistic and believe that collectively we can solve these problems. And with time and investment, the vision that Amelia laid out at the beginning of the webinar can be achieved. Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to invite the other panelists to join me in a conversation. I have some questions that I will ask, starting with Chris and Beth. And given some of the things I just said, I expect that, that they won't be surprised. So I want to start with Chris, because I really am very excited about the detail of the information that's being collected in that study. And in fact, they haven't even fully exploited the spatial detail that they have. But the challenge there is, as you do work like that, you need to protect the privacy of the people who are involved. And I have no doubts that Chris and his team are doing this adequately. But if I stand back and think more generally about this kind of work, it is a concern. Certainly one way that we deal with it is by, in essence, locking data down into places where only certain people can even look at it. I think our science tends to lean and prefer a more open approach. So I'm curious to know what Chris has to say about those issues. You need to unmute.
Thanks. Those are excellent points, ones we grappled with for a long period of time because, as Barbara points out, we collected data at a very fine-grained spatial resolution, and along with the GPS travel paths that the phone collects, we were also, as I noted, sending out prompts to answer short surveys. One of the major foci of the study was risk behavior among youth, and the kinds of questions we were asking could lead youth to be reporting on felonies, in some instances, in space and time. These data would then be available for analysis and pose a range of concerns about security, confidentiality, and so on. As Barbara also pointed out, these kinds of arrangements involve locking down data and having a high security data enclave with restricted access and so on. And certainly we've followed that model. On the other hand, we want to, in the long run, provide access to these data. And while some in the community have used a variety of techniques to try to obscure spatial data for the purposes of public release, I actually think that ultimately we should be moving toward a model where we do release data publicly, we release actual spatial coordinates and so on under strict agreements. Possibly a model for doing this are the federal restricted data centers that the census sponsors, in which ultimately soon I believe we will have a whole range, access to those centers to a whole range of studies beyond just individual level census data, but 15 or 20 other nationally sponsored surveys that could in theory be linked at the individual level. Again, these are high security enclaves and they are limited currently around the country. But a model that would allow for the proliferation of these data centers, carefully monitored, I think would at least promote the possibility of accessing data like this at the individual level and then linking highly detailed survey-based data, such as what the Adolescent Health and Development and Context provides, with a whole range of other data resources, including survey and administrative.
So I keep hitting my the wrong button. So Beth, let me turn to you because I'm interested in your use of the Shelvis data. And your study is an example of many that are increasingly drawing on proprietary data sets to do the work. And the use of those data creates some special problems and challenges. And so I wondered, thinking more broadly, not just the specifics of yours, what you might have to say about that. How do we move science forward in a way that studies can be replicated and reproduced if we're using data that are proprietary?
Yeah. Well, I want to point out that the Shelvis data is, the original data is free. And so the value added that they did at University of South Carolina at the Hazard Center there is to package the data, assemble data from multiple sources and make sure that the measures are as consistent as they can possibly be, and so that researchers like myself and others can go in and use it. It used to be free when it was grant supported by the National Science Foundation, but when that funding ran out, they had to go to a purchase model. And so that's one type of proprietary data. And certainly the value that they added to the data by packaging it and making it accessible to others is really a tremendous contribution. They are very much in favor of having people use it. Other proprietors of data may feel less willing to share the data because they generated it. And so I'm thinking of some of my colleagues here at Brown who are working with private companies to monitor, for example, grocery store purchases, where whenever we scan our discount card into when we're purchasing groceries and telling people what our purchasing patterns are, we're giving that company data that they then use to figure out how to market their products more effectively. And that type of proprietary data is different, right? Because those companies own it and they can decide who they can share it with and under what terms they share it. I think that there are great opportunities there, but researchers have to be very careful about the relationship they enter into when they use that kind of proprietary data, because there are ethical questions about, are you representing the best practices in social science, or are you working with this company to meet their kind of marketing needs, or to make them look better? And so there are multiple arrangements that exist for using that kind of data, and each of them needs to be carefully thought through. But a systematic thinking through of who these people are, where does the data come from, and when I say these people, I mean who owns the data, where did they get it from, how do they want to see it used? Those are really great questions that we need to think about quite carefully as we're on the brink of this sort of data revolution.
Thank you. Emilio, I wanted to ask you a question, both in your role as leader of this whole enterprise and also your role in the National Science Board. How do you see these issues of confidentiality, privacy, also proprietary data within the context of the desire of the National Science Foundation and others to promote data sharing?
Well, clearly, the direction of data sharing for the last couple of decades has been increasingly the funding sources pressuring scientists to make their data available as soon as possible, certainly by the time any article is published from the research. At least the data that was in the article, and ultimately within a short period, all the data that was collected under the grant. So that's a direction that the NIH, NSF, and others have taken with regards to data sharing. I think in practice it's not as even. I think researchers still have a lot of reluctance to do so. I think the mechanisms for ensuring that people put up their data are still uneven. So I think some kind of more regularized treatment would be desirable. Now, in the National Science Board, I haven't seen that yet come up in my 2 meetings that I've had since I joined. I think what is clear is that the direction of the science at the National Science Foundation is for increasing cross-directorate collaboration. There is now a plan to have 10 big ideas driving funding at the National Science Foundation that they're going to be released soon. I think France Cordova and others have begun to give talks across the country and overseas about their ideas, and they're getting good reception. I think they're exciting ideas. None of the ideas are single directorate. Some are by 3, some have 6 or more directors engaged with those ideas. So I think that speaks to even more pressure on the social and behavioral sciences to learn to share their data and to deal with the confidentiality issue, because the other fields which are not so worried about that, because it's dealing with natural science phenomena, are of course used to putting everything up in their research. And I know when I discussed this with NASA, when I had some NASA grants, it was hard for them to understand why I was worried about putting up all the data we collected, given confidentiality issues, and that we had to take a lot of time to strip identifiers and things like that. So I think we do have to, and that's one reason why the idea of regional data centers is important, is if SBE is going to be a complete participant in the new era of cross-disciplinary science, which looks to be the way NSF is trying to push the sciences, we need to get better and quicker at dealing with these issues of how to make data available to the public.
Thank you. I'm going to, there was a question from the audience that I'm going to direct towards Chris. And so the question that showed up in the box was, in this digitally collected data that we are using in our big data sort of applications, what do you do to establish the reliability of those data? How do you know about their quality? What do you do? Oh, you need to unmute.
Thanks. This is a really important question, and goes to our trust in social survey data at baseline. And you know, if we trust our social survey data reports, we can use those to verify, corroborate what we're finding on, for instance, ecological momentary assessment, those real-time surveys on the phone. So, for instance, if a youth reports a last 30-day use of alcohol, for instance, at a particular rate, we should expect to see a rate over the course of a week that aligns with that based on the ecological momentary assessment, the phone-based surveys. And generally speaking, we find that rates are more or less within those the range of the survey reports, particularly when you take into account group-based activities. But the question then is, what's the ground truth? And do we trust the social survey data? We've become used to trusting those survey data because that's effectively all that we have. Perhaps it's not a good idea to continue to assume the social survey is the ground truth. Perhaps we need to consider the real-time reports as being their own form of ground truth and find other ways to corroborate the reliability of the data, possibly by asking our respondents in focus group circumstances how truthful they were and so on. At this point, we do see some comparability between the survey and EMA reports. leading us to believe that we're doing reasonably well with respect to reliability.
So Beth, I'm going to ask you a piece of another question coming through from the audience, and that is, how do you see the roles of government and non-government organizations and then other commercial sources in providing the data that we need and funding the data that social scientists need to do our research? It's a small question.
Yeah, so let me just clarify. You want me to talk about the roles of government and non-governmental organizations?
And commercial, all the different. So the question really came through as, do we need the government to even be investing in data collection anymore? I could ask it in a more pointed way.
Yeah, well, I would say clearly that very strongly, yes, we need the government to be involved in data collection, and here's why. The federal government is the only organization that can really guarantee high response rates, and that when social science data collection becomes run by organizations, then response rates go down because because potential respondents don't see the same sort of either legitimacy or need for, or potentially the sort of consequences of not answering. You know, so the response rates are really different to federal surveys than they are to private surveys. And response rates are so important for making sure that the data that we collect are unbiased. I want to also go into some of the literature that I've been reading about long-term outcomes after Hurricane Katrina, because I think it illustrates this point really well about the difference in the data that you collect through sort of administrative data, through ongoing activities, and the data that's available through federal surveys. So we don't know hardly anything about the disaster impacts on people beyond the first year after Hurricane Katrina. And the reason why is because, you know, people really focus on that emergency period, but there's less focus on how do people actually recover in the long term. There have been a few studies that have come out that have used credit data to look at people who were resident in New Orleans at the time of Katrina and compare them in a quasi-experimental design to people who were like them in some ways that are observable ways, to see whether the spending and consumption patterns and the income patterns of Katrina-affected people were different on average than those who were not affected. So this is a great tool to use. This data is great, but we don't know anything about the socio-demographic characteristics of those people. And so a lot of the things that we put into our studies as control variables like age, gender, race, ethnicity, these are not observable in that kind of administrative data. And so with federal data that is collected by the Census Bureau, we have those socio-demographic measures where we can begin to look more deeply at differences within society and how they affect outcomes like post-Katrina financial recovery. So I think that that's why we still need the federal government to be heavily involved in data collection.
Thanks. Emilio, I imagine you have some thoughts about that as well. So if I could ask you, you know, how do you see the role of the federal government and other organizations inside and outside of government in funding the data infrastructure that's needed for us to do our work?
A lot of the data that we deal with is fundamental data, fundamental science about society. And I think that is where the federal government, and especially things like NSF and NIH, know a particular role to play in ensuring the quality of that data. The mission-driven agencies will only collect what helps their mission, just like a business only collects what helps them market a product. And that's a very limited vision about the world and the society that we live in. So I think the broad mission agencies like NSF and NIH are concerned about, the American people and even more broadly. And therefore, that ensures that the data is more complete. It is held to standards for everyone of a highest level. It creates competition between researchers for the best work in a way that, again, mission agencies tend to favor scientists who deliver a product that they like. And that is good for their mission, but it's not necessarily good for the science, more broadly spoken. So I think absolutely, if the science data collection is farmed out to the private sector or even to purely mission agencies, I think the future of science is threatened, and we want to understand the society we live in.
Thank you. Chris, I want to ask you, is it even conceivable to imagine you could scale up the kind of study you're doing to be national in its coverage?
Well, I do. I think perhaps not in the form that we attempted, in part because that something like this hadn't really been done before at this scale. And some of the features of the study, for instance, walking youth through 5 days of the week to actually confirm or help have the youth help us clean the data, the GPS data, was an effort to see whether this is a viable strategy. How effective are we in covering the youth travel path over the course of the week, in making sure that we are getting responses that are representative of the week? That actually was a quite costly addition, but actually helped then confirm that I think we do pretty well just with the phone. So going forward, would we be able to, for instance, just take advantage of the fact that the smartphone use is increasing? It is, I wouldn't say necessarily ubiquitous, but very prevalent even in low-income communities among youth, and certainly adults as well. Could we use this as a platform for then administering surveys that are continuous at some level, perhaps not at the burden that we designed our study for, 5 prompts a day, but prompts that were continuous enough to capture changes over time, again, responses in real time, but perhaps also updates on a family situation, on residential moves, on education, and so on. Is this a viable strategy for reducing costs in the long term by avoiding the kind of very expensive in-home interviewing that has dominated the social survey model for decades? I think I'm not willing to say absolutely that would be the case, that we could pull this off, but I think based on our preliminary results here in a one mid-sized urban area, certainly among youth, which aren't necessarily the easiest population to work with, I think this is a viable strategy and could actually result in significant cost savings over time.
Well, that's great. Beth, I have a question for you from the audience. And the question is, do you think that we would be well served, and this is from an environmental scientist, to develop a standard framework for collecting environmental data from various sectors that would guide the work that everybody would do as a way to better integrate science?
Yeah, I think that's a really, I think we would be well served by standardized data collection on environmental measures. The trick is that when we decide what those measures are, we have to include social scientists and environmental scientists, because the linkages between the environment and society are so complex and often involve multiple links. And so we have to make sure that there's a good understanding of how the weather, or a weather event in the case of my data, actually produces population mobility or population change. And that's where I hope to, the direction I hope to go in. But right now we are not able to observe all of those linkages, and and put them together. So I'm very much in favor of social and environmental scientists working together to try to understand population and environment interactions. I think it's going to be a complex data collection process.
Thank you. Emilio, I want to ask you another question that comes from the audience. It's another one about data sharing, and that is, how far is the research community willing to go to make data available? For example, are they willing to just make it generally available to anybody in the public, anybody who might want to use it? How much are we willing to share? Are there boundaries?
Well, clearly the data needs to be stripped of identifiers to make it available. I think beyond that, it probably should be available to a large extent. One of the things that's also happening at the national level that's relevant to that question is that as we move to working with the natural sciences more, you realize that our data, which is driven by the surveys and by the census, is at a times scale completely out of sorts with the data from the natural sciences. I mean, they have data by the second on CO2 emissions across the country measured by flux towers. They have data on stream flow. They have data on all these physical phenomena that they can put into models at a very fine time scale, and then they look to us and say, okay, we need to put some human dimensions on this model. And we said, well, our last census was 8 years ago. That's the last time we took a look at the population. And so we have a problem doing integrative modeling work, given that our data is very episodic. I mean, you have individual scientists, as you mentioned, who have projects that link data in interesting ways, but it's not at a national scale, which is one reason why we started this whole exercise. You know, can we develop a national cyber infrastructure for social and behavioral science that can ensure a national picture, but at a level of detail of both space and time granularity that can actually tell us on a continuing basis the state of all these social variables, just like natural sciences can tell us all about physical variables. Until we get there, it's going to be very hard to have effective collaboration. And I think that has to be one of our big investments.
Thank you, and you've set me up perfectly for the minute I have left to answer one of the questions here, which is, we have been talking about a data resource and infrastructure regional data centers that are focused on the United States. But every single person in this webinar is well aware of the fact that the questions of interest to us, the data of interest to us, don't stop at national boundaries. And in fact, we all do have very much a global perspective on this, and there are efforts elsewhere around the world to do this kind of quilting or stitching together, if you will. Our focus was on the U.S. primarily, although in the volume there are several examples of global applications. But we're focused that way here, in part because it's a way to focus the questions for the purposes of the webinar today. If we can solve these questions locally, we have a better chance of solving them globally. So I see we have one more minute. Michael, if you want to come back in, I think this is your moment.
Well, thank you very much, and I feel the warm embrace of the quilt of big data, and I want to thank all of you, our panelists, Barbara and Emilio, Christopher and Beth, for joining us today, and I want to thank the hundreds of people out there that have joined us for this webinar. In the coming weeks, you will be receiving, all you registered users will be receiving an email that includes a link to the archive webinar and possibly to some of the slides. as well as answers to some of the many questions that we didn't get to today, and this will all appear on methodspace.com. And then please stay connected with us on that blog, Methodspace, for information about upcoming webinars and about big data and methods applications in general. And please keep reading the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science for fascinating topics like this. Not all of them are going to be methods related, but they're all going to be, again, about public policy and about really great applications of social and political science that you can use. We thank you very much again, and we'll talk to you all again soon. Bye.